Well, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming in from. We are excited to do this. This is one of our technical webinars, and we always get a lot of good turnout. We get some really good questions that come in. Today, we're going to be talking about custom drivers. This is a new capability that Domotz has added within the last few months. And we've gotten it to the point where we can really do some demos and get people started and really get everybody an understanding of how these can help benefit you. Through our presentation today, we're going to have Giancarlo and Georgi, one of our key development engineers, right, talk to how all this good stuff works. It looks like people are starting to, I guess I'd say, top off on the coming in. So as always, I like to go over a few housekeeping items here. We'll be quick about this. I know you guys have seen these multiple times, but this is live. Take advantage of that GoToWebinar control panel, ask your questions. We've got people standing by that can help answer this. And of course, if you want to get more detailed information about this, you can always email our support team at support@domotz.com. That being said, we've got a lot to talk about, so let's get through this agenda. You all know Giancarlo. You may be less familiar with Georgi, but Georgi is awesome. He's based out of Bulgaria and always does a great job of presenting and talking to our customers. So I expect great things from our friend Georgi here. And then, of course, you guys know me. In fact, you probably see too much of me as far as you're concerned. We are going to talk about what custom drivers are. I'll kind of lead that into how it can help you from a business perspective. We'll talk about some examples that we see coming up, not only of things that kind of we've imagined, but also things that our customers have talked about. So we'll briefly touch on that. Giancarlo then is going to dive into the architecture, the mechanism, right? How you get access to the documentation, or at least the location of that. One thing I will point out is that whatever we show you on the slide, we're going to provide that to you through either a blog post or on one of our web pages. So you'll be getting that information at the end of this webinar. And then Georgi will take over and start showing some examples of how you actually implement some of the JavaScripting, talk about some of the different libraries that are associated with it and how you use that. And we'll give a couple of examples. My hope is that by the end of it, we have time for some Q&A, because I know that there'll be some good questions that come from this. Let's get moving. I promised I would take less than 5 minutes for this. So what is a custom driver? You know, Domotz is not going to help you with any new tailor-made golf clubs, okay? We're not going to be a chauffeur. It's not about how we're driving you around town. What it is going to do for you, though, is it's going to connect you and Domotz to the devices that are in your network, providing you with a lot more information and details than what you would have seen in the past, right? It allows you to access the device's data and then show that in our UI, right? Giving it visibility to you in a way that is not standard to our normal Domotz user interface. The other cool thing about this is while you can extract data from these devices, whether they're IoT devices, eventually maybe extracting data from the cloud, right, in the future, but it also gives you a way in which you can kick off commands or activate functions within those devices as well. So if those devices have APIs or have some sort of protocol that allows you to trigger a command in those devices, you'll be able to do that. And you'll see some of that today. This really unlocks a lot of power within the devices in your network. But the question always comes up, okay, how will I actually use this? Here's just a couple of examples that, you know, our team has thought up, and some of these are ones that that our customers have thought of. But being able to look into a database, right? Getting more insight into that. Being able to look at servers that are being hosted, whether they're a physical machine or whether they're actually virtualized machines, right? Being able to interrogate those, looking at things like what applications are running and how can I present that inside the UI. I like this example of certificate checks. That actually makes a lot of sense when it comes to web services. If you want to be able to click a button, have it go and access these certificates and see like when they expire and show that information, you can do that. digital signage. I personally love this example because of my history in the AV world, but being able to interrogate the smart displays that are on the network, look at things like what inputs are they tuned to, what's the volume level, if volume's important, are our systems muted, right? Being able to show that, and then even being able to have a button which may trigger a change in that. These are some of the cool things that you can do. This last bullet I think is interesting. In fact, Giancarlo and I were on a phone call the other day with a customer who leverages gateways to look at things like Z-Wave and LoRaWAN and 6LoWPAN, some of these other non 802.3 based technologies, but being able to interrogate the gateway and then take actions, right? Resetting the gateways, power cycling systems, right? I think it's an amazing way of using these custom drivers in a way that is different from the standard use of Domotz, but really as a network infrastructure type of tool, right? Something where you can monitor and manage that network infrastructure. You now can get more details into this system and you can take actions on it. With that being said, I want to turn it over to Giancarlo so that he can start talking about the architecture. And Giancarlo, by all means, let me know when you want me to move the slides, okay?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot, GB. So very good introduction about the custom driver and the capabilities offered by the custom driver. Just a reminder to everybody, all the information that so far Domotz is able to extract in an advanced way from devices is based on some software or some code that Domotz has developed, we store in our cloud, and we execute through the means of the Domotz agents or the Domotz proxy agent. But a reminder, Domotz is a monitoring solution which is in the network monitoring solution world is considered agentless. So we don't have a software on every single endpoint that we want to monitor, but we monitor through the means of other protocols that we can leverage, like SNMP, like SSH, Telnet, HTTP against those devices. And we already leverage those protocols when we develop our what we call the internal drivers. You're familiar with the possibility through Domotz to power control a PDU or check how the devices are connected to a switch or the signal level on an access point. All this information are retrieved internally by Domotz automatically for you. You don't need to develop any software. But we want to extend that. We want to allow you to interface with your own device in your own way. So that's why we designed this architecture where we allow every single Domotz user to write a simple software, and then we will see how simple that can be. The software or the code is stored in our Domotz cloud. You as a user will be able to test this code against one of the devices among all the agents that you install, all the Domotz sites that you monitor. And then if you go to the next slide, you can execute basically the same software or the same code against all the agents and all the devices that where that kind of code is applicable. How this code works is basically, you as I was mentioning, you store the code into the cloud. The code is passed in a secure way to the agent, and that is applied to every single device where you want to extract information or you want to execute, as JB was mentioning, a custom action onto the device. So let's see what are the capabilities offered by the custom, this concept of the custom driver. So you will be able to write a simple JavaScript code directly into the Domotz UI. We have an inline code check. Our IDE is capable of checking the syntax of the code that you write, but more importantly, it allows you to validate the code that you write. So there is an inline error check basically. Now, once the code is validated, let's say you have associated the code to an agent and then associated the code to a specific device, what Domotz does is extract multiple variables through the means of periodic polling on the device, extracting the variables. So we have a dynamic extraction of new variables. So for instance, if you want to monitor through SSH the volume, okay, the volume of the server, and tomorrow you add the new volume on that server, through the means of the custom driver, the system will automatically discover that there is a new volume and it will start monitoring that new volume. The same applies to users that you want to check on a Windows machine and so on. Okay, through the means of this custom driver, you also have the possibility, as JP was mentioning, to act on the device. So there will be a button or multiple buttons to send command to the end device, and we will see example about that. As I was mentioning, you have a test for executing the software, both the validation, the get status, which is the periodic check of the variables, and then the execution of the custom action. All this information are available in the UI, but also on the public API. So you can extract the last snapshot of the variables, but also the history through the public API. Now, we will soon move to the demo, which is the core of our presentation. We are, if you move to the next slide, JB, what we will cover during the demo. Sorry, I forgot to mention. There is a reference to our documentation. We will deliver this presentation to you after the webinar. So there is a user guide which drives you into the usage of the custom driver within the Domotz UI. There is a reference to the programming language, so the API and the structure of the code for the JavaScript. But most importantly, there are a few examples. There are probably 10 different examples on GitHub that you can download, you can use, you can apply on your own agent and devices. Now let's go into the demo. We will cover the creation of a new custom driver. We will see how you can write the code directly into our UI. We will see an example on how to use SSH for extracting information from an ESXi device, or HTML parsing out of an IoT device, or even accessing other examples. As I was mentioning, you can do telnet to the device. You can do a RESTful API call through the means of HTTP against the device, and so on. And then we will see how to apply the driver to the device, doing the validation of the code, extracting information, and then at the end also the custom action execution. Now I will let Georgi to present from this point on.
Hi everybody, let me start sharing my screen.
I was muted, sorry about that. Yeah, let me transition this to you. Let's see, make you the presenter. All right, you should be ready. And Giancarlo, why don't we turn off our webcam so that way this can blow up the whole screen for everybody here.
Very good.
Okay, so I think you should be able to see my Chrome window now. And I can start off with first explaining where you can start off to create a new driver. Basically, on the left-hand side, once you log into your Domotz account, there is this services and driver section where you can go to the driver, custom drivers tab. And here you can see all your team's drivers, where we will start off with creating a new one. My first example. And of course, you should also be entering a description for the driver to explain to the rest of your team what it does. Once the driver is created, we can actually go inside the integrated IDE, where we can see a few different items on the UI. On the left hand, we can see the driver properties, the name, description, if the driver requires any credentials, the minimal sample period for the periodic executions that we do against the device that the driver is assigned to, and the timeout for the remote call that we do towards the device. So how long would we wait until the device responds to the whole driver execution. We can also see some pre-populated data for the validate and get status functions that Giancarlo mentioned before. These are our core functions and are needed for every single one of the drivers. Currently, we can see also that they have issues. They are underlined with to indicate that there is an error currently in the code. And this is because there is no callback to indicate the successful exiting of this function. All of the functions that your custom driver will need to have a callback like this. A reference to the D context can be found from our API documentation under the D namespace, and you can see the success explanation, what it takes as an argument and why it is needed. So going back to the code itself, in order to make our code correct, we need to have a d.success callback in each one of the functions. And the first example that I will show is to connect via SSH to a VMware ESXi device. And we know that we can connect via SSH to it, and we can first try out one command on its SSH client to see how the device would respond. Okay. So assuming that we want to extract the virtual machines for this device, and this is basically returned from the following command. Where we can see a table with the ID of the virtual machines, their names, and the file where they're stored. We will try to extract this data and store it in a custom driver variable format in a bit. So the first thing that we need to do is actually to understand how can we execute an SSH command towards the device, where we can find that out from the context information and our API documentation. Under the device, we can see an example of how to do an SSH command. So we would need to do the same d.device.send SSH command, where the first argument it takes is the SSH options, which constitute of a command, a timeout, and several other parameters. So in our case, the command we want to execute is actually this one. The prompt also that we saw was actually the following, because for different SSH servers, the prompt may differ. So our SSH client requires a prompt if it's different than this symbol. Now that we have defined the SSH options that we can send to the device, we also need to enter the callback. So basically, the way that we understand that the command has finished is we pass it a callback function. So I need to define a callback function that gets an output and an error as parameters. Another thing that we can add is logging information. So we can add console.info for the info level logs and display the output of the command that we've just executed. Now, since we have defined our first command sending, the next thing is to choose the device on which we will attempt to execute the driver on. And this is our ESXi device. Then we need to choose which function to execute, and that is the get status. Another thing that we will need to do is we need to enter the credentials. Since SSH is, requires authentication, our driver will need credentials to execute correctly. And we also have the choice to store the credentials on this device so that we don't have to enter them every single time. Once this is done, command is being sent to the device and we will receive the result in a bit. The run code output can be divided into two subsections. One is the output of the command that we've executed, any variables if we have created device variables, which I'll get to in a bit, and logging if we have added any console logs. And here we can see the output with the actual, it's a bit misaligned, but is the same data that we saw from the remote connection here. Now, the next step that we need to do is to try to parse and put this data into the form of custom driver variables. The variables is our unit of data, let's say, where we identify, let's say, we will identify the virtual machines for this VMware server. Okay. So the first thing we can try to do is actually to split the output into multiple lines. So that it is formatted better. Then for each of the lines, we can execute a function that actually parses the line. And let's see how this looks. Another thing worth mentioning is that the code is saved every 5 seconds, but if you click on the run code, it's also saved immediately before sending it to the device itself. Now, what we will see is actually a log line for each line of the output from the command that we've executed just now. So we have 13, which represents the VMID 13 for the first virtual machine, 3, 5, 6, and 7 respectively for the rest of them. Now the next thing I want would be to split it even further so that we can store it into a variable that has a name, another UID, and also the value itself. So the line elements would represent splitting the output from every single line into 2 empty spaces, let's say, so that we can actually capture these separators. Now let's see what the line elements actually consist of and how they differ from the output line. Now we can see them split into items where we have empty spaces in between them. So we can access the 0th element of this list, the second actually element to show the name, and the 5th element to show the value of this variable that we want to create. So our UID would be, as I said, the 0th element. Our label would be the first one. And the value would be the third one. I have created now these three variables that will create our Domotz custom driver variable as we have defined in our API documentation. It needs, actually, it has 4 properties, whereas the first 3 are mandatory. The first is a unique identifier for the variables. The second one is the name. Third one is the value. And the fourth one, which is optional, is the unit. Now, let's try to create one such variable. So we pass it a UID, label, and a name. And now what we want to actually do is create a variable for every single one of the lines. And actually, it's every single one but the first one, because the first one is a definition for the output we see. So the VM ID, name, and file, we want to skip it. And to do that, we will first do shift to remove the first element of the lines array. Then we will create a list with empty variables that will populate, and we will populate it with the variable that we just created. Then on the success callback, we will set the variables and see how it gets output. Actually, I have entered something that is not existing here. And since I have passed it an undefined variable, the driver actually failed. Now let's try again. There was another typo here so basically we should name our variables array plural, and then our individual variable with singular. So now this should be the correct output. While we wait, okay, it's completed now. So here we are able to see again the output, but we still do not see variables displayed here.
This is the nice thing of live demos.
Yeah. Okay. So to understand why, we will try to debug a bit further and add more log lines. Log. See if our object has any values. So while we wait, I can briefly explain the doc strings here. So our functions have a label and documentation tags that are actually defining what the function label is and actually what it does. So the get status is a procedure that is used for retrieving the data periodically and store it in a form of custom driver variables. Whereas the validate function is used to understand if the device is the one that we can assign the associated driver to. So let's try to debug a bit further why. Yeah.
Sorry, Georgi, a couple of suggestions from the audience. Probably the create variable function is not defined.
Let me check. So it's d.device.create variable, and it's part of our Domotz context. So
okay, that's fine.
Should be correct, yeah. So what we can do is we can check the code to understand what is actually going on. And it will take some time for the command to get sent to the device and back. So that's why we wait a bit for it to complete.
Hi, Georgi again. Probably Jason and JB at the same time spot the typo on line 30. There is a stringify.
Okay, let me just remove it and see how it goes. Okay. So we have all the elements, and so output line elements here. So this log line is correct. And let's add a new log line here. Just to validate if we have created a variable, and rerun this. So we do have a variable where the unit value and label are actually empty. So maybe there's something wrong with our accessing of the data. And this is why it is not working correctly. So checking back the output line elements array. So we have these items. Maybe I've misspelled it somewhere.
It's Georgi, is the index of the items that we are extracting correct? The 0, 1, 3 shouldn't be.
Let's try. Yeah. You mean, okay.
One should be 2 and 5 or something.
So 0, 2, and 5, yeah. Let's try this. So it should be 0, 2, and 4 actually. Thanks for the hints. Now we have variables with value and label, and we can pass it to the d.success callback. The d.success callback actually is our way of understanding that the command has finished, and it can either accept an argument to indicate a generic success, or accept an array of variables that actually get stored into custom driver variables. Now, if what we've done is correct, we should see them displayed in the output pop-up.
Georgi, variables.
Yes, I I just saw the typo. I did it again. Okay, so now we actually have a few variables displayed where we can see the label or the name of the variable and its value, which is the file name of the virtual machine on the VMware server. Of course, this can be actually extended to any sort of data that you extract and be able to parse successfully. And we only added one line to create the variables, but we created several, which is because we are looping every single one of the lines, and we actually dynamically create these variables. Now, the next thing I would like to mention is how we can create an action function. So apart from the periodic execution, we also allow you to execute on-demand commands on the device in the form of action functions. Their structure follows the same rule, where you need to have a success callback to indicate that the command has executed successfully. And the other mandatory things in this case are the label, which you will see how it gets displayed once the driver is applied to a device. So let's try to add a reboot custom action. And the documentation is that this will reboot the device. So how do we execute a reboot on this device is we will just send that command as an SSH option. And the callback function can be defined. Again, if we want for it to be a simpler use case, where if we have an error, we can also notify that we have failed. So apart from the d.success callback, we also have a failure callback to indicate the failed execution of the script. Since the reboot command itself is a fire and forget type of command, if the device reboots, we lose connectivity to it. We will not check the output in this case. And the main purpose is to see how this custom command will be displayed under the device we associate the driver to. Now, the next thing to check is, of course, the validate function that we discussed before briefly. As I said, this function's purpose is to understand if the device supports this command that we want to execute afterwards in a periodic manner. So what we can do is we can check if the command we execute against the device has an error. So for example, if I enter a random command here, we will see an error. And let's try to also log the output. And then we also need to choose the correct function to execute against the device. Now, since the device doesn't have such a command, we should see it failing. Of course, the wait time depends on the device itself. Some devices respond faster, others a bit slower. And as we saw, the command execution actually failed. And what we can do is we can enter the command that we will need in the subsequent calls and verify again if this will work now. Okay, so maybe we have another error in our code. Let's try to step back a bit. Okay, so maybe we had some errors in the logic that I added. Okay. So let's add an info log here. The output again. Okay, so we can see that the command actually is successful in this case. Now, if we enter a different command that is not recognized, we should see a failure. And in the meantime, we can go towards our device and try to associate the custom driver example that we've just written. So this is our ESXi device, and in order to associate a custom driver to it, we need to apply a custom driver. Okay. Once the driver is applied, we should start seeing the data populated in a bit. And let's briefly discuss actually this is not the correct driver.
This is the beauty of a live demo, Georgi. It always happens, no?
Whenever
Whenever
it was flashing a bit. I don't know if it's because of the screen sharing. No.
Yeah, I see that you are also connected to our internal testing environment. As you
Yes,
know, the power of our cloud is in the production environment.
Yeah, I will show the production one in a bit. So
Good.
This is our example driver. Let's try to associate it to the device and see the data being populated. So the custom action that we've defined in the code, which is for rebooting the device, the label reboot actually appears on the right-hand side in the button label, and the description itself or the documentation tag is this on the left-hand side. This will reboot the device. So the same thing that we added here. And the data will start being fetched within a few seconds. Another thing worth mentioning, which I wanted to discuss before, is the sample period that you can define to collect the data. This should be larger than the sample period or the minimum sample period defined for the driver. And you can set it manually if you want to, every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or so on.
So just to clarify, the sample period that you define at the custom driver description, that's the minimum required one, no? So
Yes,
sorry, it's maximum frequency basically. No,
yeah.
you cannot do more. Okay, very good.
Yeah, and now we can see the virtual machines, custom variables. A second. I think I applied a filter wrongly. Okay. For every single one of the lines that we parsed. And also, you should also be seeing a historical value change for them. But the next driver example that I will show actually has a better value for this, because we just started populating data for this. So I will move to the next example driver, which is actually utilizing the HTTP protocol. And before starting that, I will just open the web page for the device that I want to extract the data for, just to briefly show again what data we would like to collect and store into custom driver variables. Now, this is a trend controller that collects some sensor information, and what we would like to put into custom driver variables is the data that we see from this table. So we would like our variables to have this label, that value, and that unit, and dynamically generate every single one of them, of course. To do that, let's first create a
That's
new
very
driver.
important that you can dynamically create the variables. So if new variables show up in that HTML page, you will dynamically create that variable. That's super powerful, Georgi.
Yeah. Okay. So we will focus on the data parsing part, not the validation for now. And how can we actually communicate via HTTP instead of SSH to the device? Of course, we can quickly check our documentation for this. And you can find it here that you can do HTTP get, post, delete, all the most popular HTTP methods are supported. Now, the next thing to verify is where does this data sit? And here we can see the URL used is, or the URL suffix is this one. So we can execute an HTTP get towards this and see if the data is there. How can we do an HTTP get? Is by following this example. Again, the parameters that the command accepts is the options, which are the HTTP options that have URL, headers, body, but also the second parameter is the callback, where we have an error, response, and body as parameters. Let's go back to executing the HTTP command. So let's define our options. And as I said before, we can define the URL to be this one. And since I did not enter any authentication, this seems to be a non-restricted page, so my driver will not require credential in this case. My get status is still underlined because it does not call d.success, which we will do in a bit. We have error, response, and body. So before trying to parse anything, let's try to log the body and see if we can access the same data that we see on the UI. And let's choose the correct device. Now, we don't have any issues since it's production, of course. And we can also see a body that contains some information. Maybe we can use some sort of a HTML parser or formatter to quickly see it in a better UI. And okay, maybe I've copied part of it. But what we are interested in now is to understand if the data, the sensor's data is a part of the log that we just displayed. And we can see it here, that at least part of the sensors is really existing there. Now, how can we parse this HTML body? We've actually added a helper utilities function to parse HTML. And you can see references to it in our API documentation, where it accepts the content or the body. Options are optional and document is also optional. And it returns a parsed Chiro API object, which is an external library that we've decided to add in the sandbox of the custom drivers, where you can reference the HTML tags to retrieve your relevant data. So let's try to use that helper function. Did.html parse for the body. And let's see if we've successfully parsed it or if it has any issues. On logging data, so maybe there was some issues. Let's see if we defined it correctly. Okay. Actually, return the result now. So we have a Chiro API object that we can traverse or use the DOM object definitions to find out the relevant table data. And we can do that by defining the path or understanding where exactly this HTML data exists. So let's try to from here first. And so basically the data that we are interested in is in the body, within a div with an ID wrapper, within a div with an ID, actually not the header one, but the main. Then we have another div which is main data, when another which is main content. Now the table data or the rows start populating. So we will need to access this DOM element as well, and we can do so by defining a similar DOM path, which is body, ID wrapper, main data, content, table body, and elements with this specific class. For each HTTP response, this can differ, depends on the HTML returned, but to save time, we've predefined it now. Now, to access the table elements, we use the parsed Chiro API with that path. And let's try to traverse the found HTML elements here. And the first thing to do is to try to log the data. Now we have an object for each one of the elements, but we need to parse it. So to do so, we can do it the following way. From the element, and we get its textual representation. And let's see what this contains. Now we successfully parsed or found the sensor's data, with the first element being the UID that we're interested in. The second one is the name, the third one is the value, and the fourth one is the unit in which the sensor is represented in. So let's do an additional split on new lines, just to get them in the format of an array or list. And let's try to create our variable. Device create variable with the UID will be our 0th element. Or let's first print them in order to avoid the issues from before. And see how they are represented with the splitting of the line. Maybe, okay. Let's rerun this. Okay, so actually there is one empty element, so there was a new line before that data. There is the UID, which is the second element with an index 1, and then we follow the consecutive indices. So it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So to create the variable, the UID will be data lines with an index 1. The label or the name will be with an index 2. 3 will be the value, and 4 would be the unit. So let's add this variable to our variables list and see the resulting variables that we've generated. So now we can see the same data that we are seeing in the device's web UI. So outside air, boiler, all these variables have been created in our system as well. Now I was saying that I'll show a historical representation of a better variable. So I've associated a similar driver to that device, where we can see the data being populated periodically. And for this sensor, we can see how it has changed over time with a periodicity of 5 minutes. So we have two representation modes. One is for numerical values, which are here. The other ones were for string or textual based values. But in this case, we have numerical values. With this, I think the live demo itself can progress further. We have successfully showed a couple of custom driver examples. And I will leave the next to the question and answer session.
Awesome, Yorgi. I think this is good stuff, right? You've shown a lot of things here. I have to say, everything that you showed me makes me appreciate why I became an electrical engineer and not necessarily a software guy. But the things that you showed were good, were really good. We are at the top of our hour. Giancarlo, there's one question that you and I constantly get, and I want to make sure we address that. And it has to do with repositories, right? We often get the question about, is there going to be a repository for this, for code examples? Can you respond to that?
Absolutely, absolutely, GB. That's a constant question that we receive when we talk about custom driver. So currently there is a GitHub repository with example from Domotz. So some of the examples that Georgi has shown you are already available there. On top of that, there are other. I mean, there are examples on how to use Telnet, probably example on how to use even SNMP. So more example. We are more than happy if there is any customer or user, Domotz user that want to contribute to that list or that repository, more than happy to show and organize the code in that repository. As I said, it's a GitHub repository, so you can have all the Git capability for pushing, retrieving your code, and so on. One thing to mention, currently the IDE for editing the code is available on the Domotz UI. We are planning also to allow users to push the code through the public API, which means you can have your own continuous integration script that retrieve the code from your GitLab or GitHub and then push into Domotz, execute the code, and so on. So there are a lot of activities that we are planning to do on top of what we have already.
Yeah, I mean, to point that out, right, that this is really just the beginning of what we think is some really good stuff for our users. And I like the fact that we are going to have a repository where people can, you know, pull examples out to help them with the scripting, but also be able to push examples into it or things that they do that are useful. So we really like to build on top of a community, right? And we believe the community makes us stronger. And so I think having that will be really, really good. Giancarlo, I want to point out one more thing, which is, you know, if you guys are, if you have ideas, right, things that you think would be useful drivers for us to create as examples for people, by all means, send a message to support@domotz.com. Giancarlo and I'll look at that. We'll get with Yorgi, we'll get with the team, right, his team, and we will see how we can help you and if we can help you. So with that being said, Giancarlo, is there anything else that you want to mention, or should we close this out and let people know that they'll be able to get this recording and the examples?
Yeah, absolutely. There has been a few questions here and there. We addressed those questions during the webinar, directly to them. Absolutely, we are open to answer to any question about custom driver, even through our support line. And yes, this webinar has been recorded, so you will receive an email with the link to the YouTube video for this webinar.
Yes.
That's just been asked by Alberto.
And even if you didn't watch the recording, you'll be able to go to domotz.com, and under our resources tab in the upper right, you can see our webinars, and this will be posted there in another couple of probably days after GoToWebinar processes the video. So thank you everybody for your time. Yorgi, you did an awesome job. I really appreciate doing that demo and showing how we can get more data. And I just want to say more to come. So thank you everybody. We'll talk to you soon.